Okay, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Fiona Sampson, who is a poet, a literary biographer, a writer, and professor emerita of poetry at the University of Roehampton. She is a leading British poet, um, and a writer about plays other than a literary biographer. Her most recent collection of poems, Come Down, has been published in 2021, and it has been showered with a lot of award prizes. She is also an MBE, that is the most excellent order of the British Empire, a distinction she has received for services to literature, an award that was given to her by the Queen. And she also has multiple awards from the Arts Council of England and Wales, the Society of Authors, Arts and Humanity Research Councils, Poetry Book Society. Her work has been translated into 38 languages and has been honored with international prizes in different countries: US, Bosnia, India, France, North Macedonia. Um, and she's also a critic, a broadcaster, librettist, and she has collaborated frequently with musicians and visual artists. She has also organized, directed an international poetry festival, and she's a council member of the Royal Society of Literature and is trustee of the Royal Literary Fund. And it is a pleasure to invite her, to listen to her. And her lecture today is called Romantic Terraiin: Interactions with the Landscape and with Each Other.
Thank you very much, Viorica. It's very nice to be with you all in Salamanca and also in a romantic English landscape. And
Mhm.
I'm going to start, I think, today from the landscape and move backwards. So I'm going to show you three pictures, if I can. Here's one. Very nice landscape with reeds in the foreground, a lake, woods in the background. And this one, very atmospheric and romantic Gothic mist in a wide avenue of trees, a ride, as they call them in 19th century novels, because obviously that's what this ride was laid out for. It's a recreational place for riding up and down, for promenading up and down as well. And this one, which is a little town called Grosmont on the Welsh-English borders, sitting inside its landscape. And the reason I'm showing you these three photos is I'd like us to think about the extent to which everything that you can see in them is man-made. We can't quite juxtapose them with each other, but here's a medieval carp lake, so a pond that's dug out in medieval times for farming fish for eating. And behind it is a forested area of pine forest. I hope you can see my cursor moving like this, which is factory farming of pine trees for wood pulp. And at the top of the hill, although they didn't build the hill, is the second largest Neolithic hill fort in Britain, so one of the biggest in Europe. So a, a, a castle, as it were, an earthwork castle from 3,000 years ago, and some forestry from the 20th century, and a carp lake from the 14th century. And in this picture, as I already said, this is Monington Ride, which is 2 kilometres long and runs beside the banks of the River Wye, a very famous um, beauty spot in Britain, which was made famous by the Romantic era, by Romantics, by Romanticism, and which 200 years after it was planted has now successfully grown into the very character that its planters will have dreamt of. So the Romantic landscape was designed about the aesthetic of the sublime and the beautiful that Edmund Burke talked about. So there's beauty here, very obviously, and it's also quite sublime in the sense that it's a great long vista, especially when it's not foggy, and it's quite inspiring. But it's also the picturesque, which is the third Romantic era landscape aesthetic. We'll come back to the picturesque in the course of talking this afternoon. But the picturesque is, as its name suggests, a desire to find in the natural landscape or in a planted landscape, to create in a planted landscape, what you can put in a picture, what sits inside the frame, the viewfinder, as we would say now, very nicely. And the home of the picturesque is the Wye Valley, where Monington Ride is planted, and specifically the estate at Foxley of Sir Uvedale Price, which is about 2 miles from this photograph and about 4 miles from this photograph. Well, it seems that no such romantic contrivance has gone on in the positioning of Grosmont in its landscape. But this too is man-made, and I don't just mean the buildings, or indeed the Gothic ruins of the castle, which you can just see in the foreground with its moat. Here's the moat, here's the castle. The fields, the arable, the pastures, which go up to the tree line and not beyond, are part of the great 18th, late 18th and very early 19th century agrarian revolution, which changed the way Britain was farmed. The idea was that there were modern ways of farming which were much more efficient than the old strip farms that you see everywhere, mostly everywhere in Europe, from northern France to indeed Transylvania. And the traditional way of life in which people would have lived in this village, Grosmont, and worked, would have been peasants and worked common land, which nobody in effect owned, in strips as subsistence farmers, but also given their labour to the great landlord, the great local landlord, was transformed by this notion of scientific farming in the 18th century because landlords, the great aristocrats, enclosed the farmland of Britain, and they enclosed it with these very characteristic hedges, which you can see everywhere, because obviously planting hedges was a lot cheaper than building walls. A rather wonderful Romanian poet friend of mine called and professor of art, Magda Kurnich, calls them vegetable walls. And they're plant walls which divide fields into large areas on which obviously cattle can be grazed, sheep can be grazed, or they can be sown with barley or wheat or rye. But nobody has a right of way across them. They belong to one person, and large amounts of them belong to each one person. So suddenly all the people living here in the village are not working the land. So they leave for the city, where they become the fodder for the Industrial Revolution and work in the factories. Those who remain are suddenly much less autonomous. They have no subsistence farming of their own. They are only employees of the landlord of all these fields. And the other thing you can see in this photograph is the tree line. Britain has got rid of more of its forestry than any other European country. But where woods remain, they tend to underline geological or geophysical traces like edges that are too steep to farm or where the topsoil is too poor to support crops. So each of these landscapes, which are actually none of them particularly far from each other, looks like the countryside, but actually each of them is entirely man-made. I mean, in interaction with nature. And because I'm British and because I care about it, I know how to read a British landscape, but I wouldn't know how to read a Spanish landscape, for example, nor indeed one in Siberia or one in northern France. What it means for us as romantics is something that overlaps with this, which is that romanticism, like everything else that happened in the British countryside, happened in it, but also to it. So it had an effect on the countryside and was affected by the countryside. But like many generations of artists and thinkers, romantics themselves, the great romantics that we still read today, weren't necessarily aware of that. Some of them were um, there's a kind of innocence in the romantic relationship to the countryside, which imagines that the countryside is something pure and something more than human, meta, as we might say, something that we can look at, that idea of the picturesque, or we can admire, or we can take walking holidays in, something we'll talk about again in a few minutes. But not something as man-made as, for example, a cityscape is. Here is one such romantic. This is William Blake. I really like this portrait of him because you could see in him, well, it's so animated. You can see he's just about to speak. You can almost hear his London accent, which is what he would have had. He was born in 1757 in London and he died in 1827 in London. And he was unusually, for a romantic writer, someone of fairly modest, or as we might say today, ordinary background. His father was an artisan. He himself was an artisan. He trained as an engraver. So really, I mean, it's an artist, and he became a wonderful artist, but it's a pragmatic trade, part of the world of printing. But he was himself, and he was a visionary. And among his most famous poems are um, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night, and Little Lamb Who Made Thee. So those are both obviously animal poems. I'm not saying anything very complex by saying that. And of the two of them, Little Lamb is perhaps the more interesting because of what it shows us about the relationship between this London-based culture maker, William Blake, and the English, and I will say English rather than British countryside. Um, Both Tiger Tiger and Little Lamb, the Lamb, were published in Songs of Innocence and Experience in 1794, which is a terrific um, double volume, which Blake himself illustrated. And as you might expect, the tiger is one of the songs of experience, and the lamb is one of the songs of innocence. So Blake was very much part, obviously, of the kind of cultural bohemia of his time, but he was also a visionary, kind of, as we might say, he had an elastic version of Christianity. Um, so it's a kind of visionary Christian, post-Christian um, take on the world. Um, and the lamb in this poem is both a small woolly creature and the Lamb of God, the Christ, So let's read this. And actually, as you read it, you can see how much it's itching, perhaps, to be a song, to be sung. Little lamb who made thee, dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead. Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb who made thee, dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. So just to fill you in, a mead is a meadow, old-fashioned sort of cod medieval word, and vales are valleys. And indeed, if you live in sheep farming country, lambs baaing after lambing time in sort of February, March, it really does echo. They are well designed for summoning their mothers. So why do I say it's longing to be a song? Well, partly because it's using this very simple form, very strict meter, lots of repetition, almost like a nursery rhyme, isn't it? Or a lullaby. Lots of repetition. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Um, and little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. And the effect of that, the formal effect of that, alongside some of the phrases like clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright, tender voice, meek and mild, is very cozy and childlike and indeed innocent. But at the same time, something very complicated is going on in this poem because it happens around, I hope you can see my cursor here. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. So that's, the Christ figure as sacrificial and um, behold the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei in the Mass. Um, and he is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. Suddenly the poet is the child who is also the Christ, who is also the lamb. So in those few lines there, he is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. And called is, of course, summoned in, like the Good Shepherd, as well as just having the same name. We're called by his name. So in those 6 lines, something very complicated conceptually goes on. And yet the poem pretends to be, as it were, written for a child to read, not just written perhaps in a childish voice, but written for a child to understand. And that's a very democratic motion by a poet who was, on the one hand, extremely eccentric and set away from, apart from his society, by being such a visionary and artistically unconventional, but is also a man of the people, not an aristocrat as writers and artists, particularly writers, had traditionally been, because only if you were wealthy, were you not just struggling to stay alive, had you, in other words, the time and the means to become a writer. So, and also William Blake came from a dissenting tradition within Christianity. That's to say, a tradition where people ran their own church communities and gave sermons themselves. They didn't look to a priest to lead them in worship. So all of that is going on in that little poem, but at the same time, it's a poem which doesn't really know much about the countryside, isn't it? It's a poem in which the lamb is a symbol. He's a lamb out of um, the carving on a medieval church pillar, capital, rather than, or out of the mass, rather than a lamb sort of in the mud on a Welsh hillside. But this is the countryside, and this is the cottage in Felpham where William Blake lived between 1800 and 1803. Something you probably need to know about England is that prosperity and settlement sort of sinks lightweight down to the southeast corner around the capital and closest to the European continent. And Felpham is near the coast of Sussex, so it's due south of London. Today it takes about an hour and a half to get there by car from London. But then it would have been very rural and relatively impoverished. And this is a very typical cottage with a thatch roof, as you can see, made of reeds. And the walls are made of flint, those stones that you can knap, and Neolithic man did knap to make tools with brick dressing. So very typical vernacular style, folk style of the countryside. And 30 years later, in not in a very similar landscape, another visionary, Samuel Palmer, who was entirely a visual artist, not also a poet like William Blake, um, settled in the Kent countryside at a village called Shoreham. And Kent and Sussex are not so far away. They're in that bit below and to the east of London. I always think it looks like the figurehead of a ship. Very similar in terms of geology and in terms of how they farm. Orchard country and lots of stooks of corn. Here you can see the stooks at harvest time and the great harvest moon. And the shepherd coming home with his dog past the harvest from the hill where the sheep will be with his hat. And the reason I've added this image is because there is this trace of a kind of mystical relationship with the countryside emerging, particularly, but not only in visual art, in the Romantic era. And it emerges in a kind of quite humble way. But it's also something that the Romantics try and reflect in their way of life. So Samuel Palmer, with a group of other young artists, two other young artists, moved to Shoreham, and they called themselves the astrologers, which locals misheard as the extologers. So they were the extologers who used to wander around at night, obviously, in order to draw pictures like this, kind of communing with the countryside when their neighbours were all hard-working countrymen, having to get the harvest in or looking after the animals or harvesting apples or whatever. There was this kind of ideal community. And in that, you can see the seeds of what you can see an affinity with the more famous communities of poets, particularly around Grasmere and in the Quantocks in Somerset. So Grasmere is William Wordsworth and his community. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the Quantocks, which is in Somerset, so that's in the south. But the other end of the long stretch of England, the southwest, hilly country, is Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. However, his time in Felpham, to come back to Blake, did also create a kind of greater interconnectedness with the country. And probably his most famous poem, certainly among people who don't read poetry, is Jerusalem, which has become a kind of unofficial, something I'm very uncomfortable with, a kind of unofficial national anthem. But the reason, and it's associated with all sorts of problematic things now, like football hooliganism, but it's a fascinating shift because what Blake has done is shift his mysticism from the kind of inert symbol of the lamb. The lamb is just there. It's kind of like got no background. It's just cut out. There's the lamb. To a kind of sense of the miraculous infusing the landscape in very much the way that something miraculous seems to infuse Parma's landscape. And it has two very famous phrases in it: England's green and pleasant land and dark satanic mills. So, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Bringing my bow of burning gold, bringing my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. And it's a moment at which you see perhaps why contemporary Britain has taken the romantic version of Britain, Romanticism's British landscape as its version of itself. There's a sense of longing and a sense of antiquity. And of course, one of the reasons for that sense of longing and of long ago is that this is the poetry, this is the literature, this is the art of the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution. So to come back to the Agricultural Revolution, it's the moment at which people are closed out of the countryside, which is enclosed by landowners, and sent to the cities, desperate for subsistence and work, to labour in the factories, the dark satanic mills, which came because the Industrial Revolution came first to Britain, first in everywhere in the world. So we are, of any country in the world, but certainly of any European country, the nation which is furthest, and culture which is furthest removed from a normal working relationship with agriculture and most urbanized. Obviously, this is still Blakean mysticism. It's still prophetic, and he's wanting a kind of mission of, a better life. There's a notion of building Jerusalem at the same time as the mills have been built everywhere. So it's a kind of very paradoxical vision, or indeed picture. And there's still a holy Lamb of God, though he can't quite let that go. The idea is that, again, this time his symbolic Christ has come to England, like Joseph of Arimathea is supposed to have done to Glastonbury, and walked upon England's mountains green. It's a lovely. This poem always makes me smile because first of all, our mountains are green, and then our hills are clouded. Well, which is it, William? Is it a splendor of green and verdure, or is it actually rather cloudy and it's always raining here? Frankly, often the latter. But as a poet in me wants to talk to you about the alternation of colour, the burning and the dark and the clouded and the sun. But that isn't our business here today. Our business here today is to kind of have a mental bookmark of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, this poem is one of the introductory poems to William Blake's 1804 Milton, an Epic. So it's really also about Milton, although this is not about Milton, but it is about the tradition of a kind of apostolic tradition, which nonconformists and Protestants like Blake and like Milton embraced, and which gave them a strong sense of being inheritors of a kind of spiritual religious responsibility. But not everybody who wrote about the countryside was religious. Some people were quite the opposite. This is Percy by Shelley in the painting when he's in Rome by Amelia Curran. So Shelley's dates are 1792 to 1822. And unlike Blake, he could be um, he could be quite relaxed in a sense about the countryside because he was born in the countryside. He is a country gentleman from Sussex, that's to say, the same region just south of London where William Blake's Felpham Cottage was, but he lived in a big mansion. Um, he spent a lot of his life outside London, although he did live in London briefly. And in 1818, he was exiled to Europe, or rather, he and his wife, Mary Shelley, went into exile because of their political beliefs, because it became a difficult time to be a radical philosopher, as Shelley was, alongside being a poet. He before he ran off with the 16-year-old Mary Shelley, he ran off with another 16-year-old Harriet, his first wife, after he'd been sent down from Oxford University for atheism. And they went to live in Wales in the house of his uncle at Cwm Ilan, Plas Cwm Ilan. You can't see Plas Cwm Ilan now because it's been, let me see if I can make give you a little bit of Welsh river. But you can get a sense of the wild, romantic landscape of the Elan Valley. This is actually the next valley down, the Ystwyth Valley in West Wales, between the Cambrian Mountains and the sea, where Shelley went on holiday and then went with his first wife, and first starts to experiment in the Easdale notebook, in his notebooks, with um, his reactions to the very wild and beautiful landscape around him. This is actually the ruins of another big house, which is called Havod, where, for example, Handel went and taught the harp to the ladies of the house. They were part of a great infrastructure of country house patrons of the art. No, but this is what happened to Cwm Ilan. The valley was flooded to provide a reservoir of drinking water for the industrial cities of Birmingham at the end of the Midlands and Birmingham at the end of the 19th century. So Cwm Ilan, ironically, became a ruin, and today it's not standing under the waters as it was blown up, and there are just foundations. And of course, one of Shelley's most famous poems of the environment is Ozymandias, which is about ruins, um, and therefore about how things change. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Um, it's an extremely enjoyable poem to read, isn't it? And one of the reasons for that is Shelley's way with an enjambment, the way he lets the sentence move over the line end. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, and land, stand, sand," that lovely chiming half sung. And then all of this about authority, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. In other words, the sculptor could see what a tyrant he was and portrayed him like that. Um, but that toppling sense of what the sculptor sees and what Ozymandias, the King of Kings, is, the sense of them toppling down together is a wonderful um, enactment of the toppling of the statue, the toppling of the ruins, and of the mortality of both the King of Kings and the sculptor. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. It's almost as long a perspective, though vertical, as the horizontal of the last sentence. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. But one of the other things that's going on, of course, is the romantic hit, as it were, of ruins. So Romanticism is also the era of the Gothic novel, starting with Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, which is 1764. Then you have Anne Radcliffe, Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794. You have Matthew Gregory Lewis as the monk a couple of years later. You have, in some ways, some elements of Caleb Williams, the philosophical novel by William Godwin, and you certainly have it in William Godwin's daughter, Mary Shelley, and her novel Frankenstein, which, of course, was partly inspired by something, as it were, um, more schlocky, more horrific still than Gothic horror. That's to say, the German shudder novel or shower roman, which Mary Shelley and Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary's stepsister and Lord Byron and Lord Byron's Dr. John William Polidori all read together in the dark and stormy year without a summer, 1816, on the banks of Lake Geneva. But that kind of sense of frisson, of an interest in the supernatural, which so often comes when religion is loosening its hold on a society, was immensely fashionable at the end of the 18th century and so in the very start of Romanticism. So here's a folly which someone discovered in a burning of suburban gardens. So this is sort of what we would call Strawberry Hill Gothic after Strawberry Hill, the mansion built in this sort of style for Hugh Walpole, who wrote Castle of Otranto, so one of the first Gothic figures. And this has got apparently sheep's teeth in it. It's got, again, flint stone, you can see. It's got shells. It's sort of half a ruin and half a grotto. And both of these were staples of ornaments of the picturesque romantic landscape. But this is a real ruin. This is Tintern Abbey, which famous, of course, for William Wordsworth. But Tintern Abbey is in the Wye Valley, the valley of the River Wye. And it's one of the sites on the Wye Tour, which, another romantic invention, was the start of tourism. In the 18th century and earlier, the sons of aristocrats went on the grand tour and went to great historic and artistic sites across Europe, particularly southern Europe, particularly classical Europe, because, of course, their education had been classical in the Latin and ancient Greek canon, and sometimes as far south as Israel and Palestine or Turkey or Egypt. But ordinary people, of course, couldn't do that. But the first Napoleonic Wars made it trickier for British aristocrats to get through France, which, of course, is the first country you come to if you're travelling overland from Britain anywhere, um, since the Napoleonic Wars were Britain and France were fighting each other. And then as the 19th century dawned, there began for the first time to be other people with money apart from aristocrats, the first industrialists, a rising middle class of doctors, vicars, lawyers. And William Gilpin um, devised the Y tour, which was a boat tour, which took 2 days and went um, as far up the River Wye as is navigable, which allowed people to look at all the correct picturesque elements. So there were gorges and forests and caves. There was a ruined abbey, Tintern. There was a ruined castle at Chepstow, great Norman castle, medieval castle. And there were also fiery furnaces because at the same time it was also an industrial landscape where iron was being smelted in newly enlarged forges. You know, the process was being um, amped up to an industrial scale. Um, so the Y became, the Y tour became a sort of iconic landscape, just as the Lake District did, and attracted many artists. So, for example, this is J.M.W. Turner, the great landscape watercolor, topographical watercolorist. I mean, he was many other kinds of artists too. But this is his version of Tintern Abbey, and there are many others. The topographical illustration is another great romantic innovation, which comes naturally, flows naturally out of the idea of the picturesque, but also out of the search for what's sublime and beautiful. All sorts of people from Edward Lear to John Constable also practiced in this genre. So, another way to explore the Wye was to take a walking tour. And that's what Wordsworth did in his lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July the 13th, 1798, which must be one of the most lengthy titles in literary history. Um, and it's a poem. I wonder why that's not going forward now. Perhaps it's because I've put this here. There. It's a poem which is famous as a landscape description, but actually it isn't really very much of a landscape description. We'll read just the opening section. And what you'll hear is how much this is about the frame. This is picturesque because, and the frame for Wordsworth is memory always. So this is Wordsworth in 1798. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season, with their unripe fruits, are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, so those hedgerows again that enclose the fields, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. With some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So it moves into sort of speculation. And further on in the poem, you come to his conclusion, which is there's a long reflection on reflection. Um, and by the end, I have to move your faces. You have, with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. So at that moment, and he's talking about the motion of blood almost suspended, at that moment he's moved from memory, he's stepped into the memory to a kind of concentrated reflection, a kind of absorption, an attention to things which tries to get beyond the self, which is an irony because romanticism is quite built around the sense of the self. Um, I want to show you, and yes. So that is a sort of landscape of this is Simon's Yacht, as it says, and this is almost certainly where, this is a few miles upstream from Tintern Abbey, where Wordsworth would have been actually writing, where he sets writing the poem. And you can see the River Wye at the bottom, and you can see the wooded gorge. So this has been a famous beauty spot made famous by Romanticism for a long time. Here's another view of the Wye in the Forest of Dean, but this is a 20th century view, and this is the opening spread of John Berger's book, A Fortunate Man. And John Berger, he collaborated with the great French photographer Jean Moore, and this takes apart the pastoral idyll. It's hard to read this because obviously this is an image of the book, but it says landscapes can be deceptive. Sometimes a landscape seems to be less a setting for the life of its inhabitants than a curtain behind which their struggles, achievements, and accidents take place. So that's a very different way of thinking of the landscape, that it's a curtain. Its beauty is actually obscuring the reality, the tough reality of life in the countryside. Almost complete riposte to Wordsworth's, oh, these lovely cottages with their plumes of smoke, I can see what their life would be like. Well, yes and no. And that's a very interesting because this is the 1970s, so it's more than 150 years after after Wordsworth's poem was written, and it's that moment at which society in Europe tries to change itself and it tries to shake off the Romantic legacy, but not completely successfully. And just before we finish, we we discovered that Tintern Abbey is a poem about memory, and let me remind you of a poem that I'm sure you will already have looked at with Viorica, which is the Daffodils poem, which of course is also a poem about memory. Um, I wandered lonely as a cloud. And the key stanza of that is the final one. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they, the daffodils, flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. There's exactly the same movement, isn't it, as the movement of Tintern Abbey, a kind of refusal to be overwhelmed by scale, which is implied, as it's implied here, the daffodils, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, never-ending line around the margin of the bay, the big ruined abbey, and the scale of the chasm of the river, but a kind of the picturesque telescopes it into something portable, something that becomes, like a kind of mental sketchbook, really. I'm sure this is not going to let me. Oh, it is. And Daffodils, of course, is famously a Lake District poem, the other district associated with Wordsworth, where he settled with Dorothy, with Robert Southey, who also became poet laureate, in fact, became poet laureate first from 1813 until 1843, whereas Wordsworth was only poet laureate after Southey died from 43 to 50 when he died. Coleridge was there too, of course. But Wordsworth was a national treasure long before he became poet laureate. And the other landscape that he loved, of course, to come back was the Wye Valley. And this is his brother-in-law's house at Brinthorpe. It's a medieval court. There's the medieval hall, the half timbering. And here are the woods, which stop to leave room for grazing at the top of the hill. And here's one of those medieval carp lakes. And that pattern of settlement which hasn't changed, that the pattern of land use has changed since medieval times. And here is a farmhouse in the same valley with a carp lake, the same sequence of carp lakes, sitting in the landscape as farming traditionally did, and which is a Romantic era farmhouse, because that was the moment at which farmers enclosed their land and became prosperous, rather than being peasants and servants of the landlord. That's the point at which land was privatized and allocated, as it were, to farmers. So this is a house that has a medieval core, but is had delusions of grandeur in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And that is almost it, except that actually, I remember I do want to just give you a little bit of awe to finish with. So this is the Mer de Glace on Mont Blanc, which is a setting of the great central scene in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where Frankenstein's creature comes back to challenge his maker and say, "Why did you make me unlovable?" And it's a place that Mary and Percy and Mary's stepsister Claire Clement all visited in 1816. They clambered up there, despite the fact that Claire was pregnant. And Percy's poems, as a result, were Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and Mont Blanc. And this is interesting because this is the other thing that they are asking the landscape to give them, which is awe. So there's a great fluidity again here. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendour, where from secret springs the source of human thought its tribute brings, of water, and so on. And then the sense of attention, which becomes not just meditation, but sort of trance, more ecstatic, which brings us back towards Blake, dizzy ravine. And when I gaze on thee, I seem as in a trance, sublime and strange, to muse on my own separate fantasy, my human mind, which passively now renders and receives fast influencing, holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe of things around. And to the conclusion, the secret strength of things which govern thought, and to the infinite dome of heaven is as a law, inhabits thee, that's the landscape. And what were thou and earth and stars and sea, if the human mind's imaginings, silence and solitude were vacancy? So let's just finish with that last sentence again. And what were thou, the mountain, and earth and stars and sea, if to the human mind's imaginings silence and solitude were vacancy? To which we're supposed to answer, well, of course it would be unbearable. They have to be bearers of meaning, and awe is our sort of divining rod, our way of discovering the meaning, the metaphysical and spiritual meaning of landscape, which brings us right back through Wordsworth's meditations and attention, through the kind of thrills of the Gothic, through Samuel Palmer's images, to William Blake's poems, and that sense of landscape as a kind of emotional and spiritual resource, something charged with meaning. And that ultimately is what Romanticism fundamentally made of the landscape, even as bizarrely the changes that were being enacted around individual Romantic artists and writers were so deeply pragmatic and mechanized and to do with agriculture and farming. And for you as students of English literature, it's worth remembering how central that is to the English, not so much the British, the English national self-image, because it is the nostalgic moment which captures with kind of sentiment or feeling what what the landscape might be, as well as a place to produce food. And that's it from me. I got a picture of mud somewhere. No, there, a little bit of fog. So let me stop the screen here. There. I think I'm back with you now, aren't I?
Yes.
Good.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Very inspiring and very profound. I wonder whether there are questions from students. If you have a question, you can just go ahead.
Can I also say that I'm more than happy for Viorica to have the PowerPoint, so if you want the images and so on, because I think sometimes it makes it real, doesn't it?
Oh, thank you very much.
It's no problem. I can.
Um,
And if you don't, I could play you a setting of Little Lamb, but I don't have to. But if you don't have any questions and you would like to hear that, you're welcome to.
no, I just wanted to say that uh, in fact, the romantic ethos is an idealistic ethos.
Yes.
They go out to nature to find God,
Yes.
which is a spirit.
Yes.
I mean, Wordsworth says, um, Coleridge says, and what if all of animated nature be but organic harps, diversely framed, that tremble into thought as over them sweeps plastic and vast one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all.
Mm.
And Wordsworth sees a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things,
Mm.
and so on and so forth. And
Mm.
and and even Shelley, who
Yes.
signed an atheist when
Yes.
he went to Switzerland, and he assigned into hotels, and everybody else was
Yes.
atheist. Even he in Mont Blanc, he senses the same spirit. That's why they feel awe, because
Yes.
I
That's
mean, the
right.
sublime is because, and they go to nature, and Wordsworth says that beautifully in the preface to the lyrical ballads. Um, the language of nature is because and the language of the rustic is because he's in contact to nature, and in nature you find the beautiful and eternal forms of things. So it's a very Neoplatonic way of
Mm.
going beyond nature. Nature is a window, and
Mm.
it's a window
Yes.
to the spirit. And because it is a window to the spirit, it is a way of self encounter. The poet
Yes.
encounters his hidden ideal personality.
Yes.
It's a
Yes. That's
kind
right.
of, although I must say, this supernaturalism ends in a kind of naturalism.
Yes. Yes.
That this pantheistic idea that God is in nature, and you find God in nature, and you find yourself through God. Somehow the romantic poet is a poet who brings God back to man and has these visions, but in this process he himself becomes God,
Yes. Exactly. That's
and
what I
deserts
like.
his
Because, yeah.
role, like
Yes.
Shelley in Ode to the West
Yes,
Wind.
exactly. Yes. My words among mankind. Yes, exactly. I mean, it's not always the case, is it? That it's a god anymore. Some of them are quite consciously atheist. It's meaning rather than God or or hope or whatever the metaphysical dimension is that allows romanticism to put the human individual as the kind of the measure of all meaning at the center of the universe, but still believe in measures of meaning and centers to a universe. It's not postmodernity. There's there's something very um transitional actually about Romanticism for all that it's kind of the cultural moment on which at which a lot of a kind of our reception of culture has stuck in a way.
Mhm.
It is that moment when people think they're atheist, but really they're post-Christian. They're really still in dialogue with Christianity. I mean, even Shelley is obviously, he's saying, please, please, oh mountain, please, what, Westwind, whatever, please, be a replacement of, kind of spiritual revelation.
Mhm.
And I think it's very striking how, um, as you say, I mean, windows, pictures, I mean, how sort of uninhabited a lot of that thinking and writing is. That's to say, it's very inhabited by, emotion, but it's not very gritty. It's not very much a figure in a landscape. I mean, of course, there are people like John Clare, a worker poet and a agricultural labourer poet. But John Clare, when he's writing his poetry, you wouldn't really know he was, a man of the fields who worked with his hands and really lived the reality of country life. He borrows the correct forms, the educated forms, doesn't he, in which to write. So there's a sense, it's a moment actually at which something happens in Britain, which I don't think happens elsewhere in Europe, or not to the same extent. Well, I think it doesn't really happen elsewhere in Europe, which is that the countryside is appropriated for high culture and becomes something that the wealthy have access to, but not so much ordinary people, actually. To where we are today, where it's a very much a middle class preserve, um, and our culture has become um, very urban, very very early and very profoundly. Um, there's quite a divide in everything, in electoral patterns, in everything between the city and the country in Britain, which doesn't really reflect the history or the deeper meaning of the countryside or the deeper reality of the countryside, but reflects how culture sees thatched cottages as ornamental and privileged and safe, but real gritty life goes on in a city street where there are street lights and blocks of apartments um, and where images of if you say to someone who is not particularly educated in Britain, if you ask them about art, what they'll think of is a John Constable landscape. They will think of a romantic landscape painting. And
Mhm.
they will think of Wordsworth's daffodils if you ask them about a poem. And it is that moment of the arts, the high arts are attractive and accessible at that moment. They're not so cerebral, but they are, but the version of the countryside that they are so often predicated upon is it's not the homeward ploughman homeward plodding his weary way anymore. It's rushing around having an experience of awe and gasping and, you know, a bit like a tourist now. You can be a tourist and be very respectful tourist, but you go and you kind of, oh, the otherness of this, whatever, of Mount Etna or Mont Blanc or wherever it is that you go. And of course, this is the start of tourism too. It is that start of the loss of the countryside, really.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Oh,
It
great. Thank you very much.
it was a pleasure to have you, a privilege to have you. It is the second time you lecture for our students, and
Yes.
we hope you will accept future invitations too.
I'd love to. Yes, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Fiona.
Thank you very much. And Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.